in the unforgiving landscape of New Mexico's desert outskirts, where the modern world reluctantly mingles with the echoes of the Old West, a story unfolds that would remind us all that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who appear to be prey. Today, we'll witness how a group of small-town criminals made the fatal mistake of targeting Sarah Matthews, a quiet elementary school teacher who harbored a past steeped in gunsmoke and vengeance. They would soon learn that behind her gentle smile lay the legacy of one of the most notorious gunslingers the Southwest had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast across the playground of Pine Creek Elementary as Sarah Matthews watched her third-grade students file out for summer break. Her delicate frame, dressed in a flowing summer dress and comfortable flats, gave no indication of the weight she carried in her heart or the skills she hoped never to use again. "Miss Matthews," little Amy Rodriguez called out, running back for one last hug. "I'm going to miss you so much." Sarah knelt down, her honey-brown hair falling softly around her face as she embraced her student. "I'll miss you too, sweetie. Remember what we talked about. Being kind doesn't mean being weak." The words caught in her throat, memories of Jake whispering the same lesson in her ear during their too-brief marriage flooding back. Jake Matthews, the name still sent shivers through the criminal underworld of the Southwest, even 3 years after his death. But here in Pine Creek, population 2,743, Sarah was just the sweet-natured teacher who had moved to town for a fresh start. As the last yellow bus pulled away from the curb, Sarah gathered her belongings from her classroom. The walls, once covered with artwork and educational posters, now stood bare. Summer vacation stretched ahead of her like the endless desert highway, 2 months to fill with something other than memories. Principal Davidson stopped by her door, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Sure you won't reconsider joining us for the faculty retreat, Sarah? Might be good to get out of town for a bit." "Thank you, Tom, but I promised my father I'd help him with the ranch this summer." The lie came easily now, practiced over years of keeping her past buried. In truth, Sarah planned to spend the break at Jake's old cabin in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the only place she felt truly close to him anymore. As she walked to her modest Ford Escape in the parking lot, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Years of living with Jake had honed her instincts to a razor's edge, even if she tried to ignore them now. A black SUV with tinted windows idled at the far end of the lot, out of place in their small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Inside her car, Sarah pulled out her phone to check her messages. One new voicemail from Marshal Thompson, Jake's old friend from his days with the U.S. Marshals Service. "Sarah, it's David. Listen, there's chatter about Cesar Ramirez getting out early. Watch your back. Jake put away a lot of his people before. Well, just call me back when you can." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she deleted the message. Cesar Ramirez, the drug kingpin whose empire Jake had helped dismantle. The man whose brother had put the bullet in Jake's back 3 years ago, before Jake's return, had ended the bloodline permanently. The black SUV's engine rumbled to life. Sarah pulled out of the parking lot, carefully maintaining the speed limit. As she headed toward Miller's general store, she needed supplies for the cabin, and old habits died hard. Never take the same route twice, always know your exits, check your mirrors religiously. Jake's lessons, drilled into her during their 5 years together, had become second nature. Inside Miller's, Sarah filled her cart with non-perishables, canned goods, dried foods, the basics needed for an extended stay in the mountains. Old Joe Miller watched her from behind the counter, his roomy eyes holding a hint of recognition. "She prayed was imagination. Heading up to the cabin again, Miss Matthews?" he asked as he rang up her purchases. Sarah forced a smile. "Just some summer supplies, Joe. My sister's coming to visit." Another lie. Sarah had no sister, but the story helped explain away her periodic disappearances into the mountains. What the townsfolk didn't know was that the cabin housed more than memories. Its reinforced walls concealed an arsenal that would make a military commander whistle in appreciation. Jake had believed in being prepared, and Sarah had never found the strength to dismantle his preparations. As she loaded the groceries into her car, the black SUV cruised past the store's front window. This time, Sarah caught a glimpse of the driver, a hard-faced man with a tribal tattoo snaking up his neck. Her blood ran cold. She recognized that tattoo pattern from Jake's files, Ramirez Cartel. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her hip, where Jake's compact Glock 43 used to ride in a concealed holster. But those days were behind her now. The gun rested in her bedside drawer, untouched since she'd moved to Pine Creek. She was Sarah Matthews, schoolteacher, not Sarah Matthews, widow of the legendary Marshal Jake Matthews, who had brought down 3 cartels and survived 15 gunfights before lucky number 16 proved his last. The sun was setting as Sarah pulled onto the road leading to her small ranch house on the outskirts of town. In her rearview mirror, the black SUV maintained a discreet distance. They were good, professional. But Jake had taught her to spot professionals. Her phone buzzed again. Marshal Thompson. "Sarah, call me, now. Ramirez isn't just out, he's hunting, and word is he's starting with the people who took down his empire." Sarah's knuckles whitened. On the steering wheel, the peaceful life she'd built in Pine Creek was about to shatter like a mirror in a shooting gallery. But as her father-in-law used to say, a Matthews never starts trouble, but by God, they know how to end it. The black SUV was closing the distance now, no longer bothering with subtlety. Sarah checked her fuel gauge, 3/4 full. She thought of her students, of little Amy's hug this morning, of the life she'd tried to build away from the violence that had defined her past. But some ghosts refuse to stay buried, and some debts can only be paid in blood. As Sarah approached the turnoff to her property, she made a quick decision. The ranch house wasn't safe. Too exposed, too many windows, too many approaches. The cartel would expect her to go home. Jake's voice echoed in her memory. "The best defense is making your enemy play your game, not theirs." She drove past her. Turn off? Watching in her mirror as the SUV's brake lights flashed momentarily in confusion. Her truck knew these roads, and more importantly, she knew every back road, trail, and washout in the county. She'd spent countless weekends exploring them with Jake, his paranoia about escape routes becoming her salvation. Sarah reached for her. The phone, careful to maintain her speed. Another message waited. "Got confirmation. 4-man team led by Marco Vega. He's Ramirez's new enforcer. Sarah, he's the one who held the knife in Juarez, the one Jake told you about. The Juarez incident." Sarah's hand unconsciously touched the gold chain around her neck. Jake's wedding ring hung from it, hidden beneath her blouse. That case had nearly broken him. 32 children saved from trafficking, but the nightmares of what they'd found in that warehouse had haunted Jake until his last day. The black SUV was gaining now, no longer bothering with pretense. Sarah could make out 3 figures inside, which meant one was missing. A second vehicle. No, Jake's training kicked in. They'd dropped someone off earlier, probably at her house, waiting. Her Ford Escape lived up to its name as she suddenly swerved onto Old Miller Road, really just a glorified cattle trail that ran behind the defunct copper mine. The SUV's superior power would mean nothing on this terrain. They'd have to slow down or risk rolling into the ravine that paralleled the road. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile as she opened the center console, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a burner phone, one of many Jake had cached around town. She'd maintained them out of habit, part of her weekly routine that the townsfolk wrote off as nature walks. She dialed Marshall Thompson's secure line from memory. "I counted 3 in the SUV," she said when he answered. "Black Escalade, New Mexico plates starting with RAV. That's cartel code for Ramirez's personal hit squad," Thompson finished. "Jesus, Sarah, they're not playing around. Where are you?" "Taking the scenic route to nowhere." She navigated a particularly rough patch of road, satisfaction flowing through her as she heard the SUV's undercarriage scrape rock behind her. "How long until you can have a team here?" 3 hours minimum. Sarah, listen to me. The cabin, Jake's old place, it's your best shot. You remember the security upgrades we installed after Juarez? The ones Jake said were overkill? Sarah checked her mirror. The SUV was falling behind on the rough terrain. Guess he owed you an apology. "Get there. Secure the perimeter. I'll bring the cavalry." Thompson paused. "And Sarah?" "Jake's gun case. The combination." "I remember. Their wedding date backwards. Jake's idea of romance. David, if I don't—" "None of that. You're Jake Matthews' widow, and I've seen you outshoot half my deputies. Just get to the cabin. Let the bastards follow. We'll end this where it started." Sarah ended the call as her truck crested a ridge. The sun was touching the mountains now, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere behind her, 4 killers were about to learn the same lesson their predecessors had. Underestimating Matthews was a mistake you only made once. She touched Jake's ring through her blouse. "One last time. I could use some of your luck, cowboy," she whispered. Then she turned north toward the distant peaks where a fortress disguised as a cabin waited. Toward the arsenal she'd prayed she'd never need again. Toward an ending that had been set in motion 3 years ago in a dusty border town. The quiet teacher was gone. In her place sat the woman who had stood beside one of the most dangerous lawmen in Southwest history and learned every lesson he had to teach. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mountain roads grew treacherous as darkness crept across the land. Sarah's Ford Escape climbed steadily through the deepening shadows, her headlights off despite the growing dark. Jake had taught her to drive by moonlight. In conditions exactly like these, his voice steady in the passenger seat. "Light makes you a target, the dark makes you a ghost." The black Escalade had fallen back, but Sarah knew better than to think they'd given up. They were professionals. They'd have night vision equipment, thermal imaging, all the toys cartel money could buy, but they didn't have what she had. Intimate knowledge of these mountains and the desperate clarity of someone fighting for survival. A memory surfaced, sharp as broken glass. Jake, on their 3rd date, teaching her to shoot in these same mountains. She'd thought it was just a quirky way to spend time together, until the night 6 months later when a rival cartel tried to grab her from the grocery store parking lot. 2 warning shots, no casualties. Jake had been so proud. "You've got the instincts," he told her afterward. "Now you just need the training to back them up." The training had been relentless. Weekends spent at the cabin, learning everything from basic marksmanship to tactical driving. Jake had called it their quality time. Sarah had called it paranoid, right up until it saved her life the first time. Her truck rounded a bend, and Sarah caught movement in her peripheral vision, a flash of metal in the moonlight, up on the ridgeline. They'd split up, trying to box her in. Smart but predictable. She reached under her seat, fingers finding the familiar shape of a metal box. Inside lay Jake's old night vision monocular, obsolete by military standards, but perfect for civilian use. She'd maintained it religiously, another habit she'd kept up just in case. Through the monocular, she counted 2 figures moving parallel to her position. They were good using the terrain for cover, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They were looking for a scared schoolteacher, not a trained survivor. Sarah checked her watch. 2 hours until Thompson's team could arrive. She needed to reach the cabin before the cartel team could establish a proper perimeter. Once inside, the odds would shift dramatically in her favor. The cabin sat in a natural defensive position, backing up to a sheer cliff face with clear lines of sight in all directions. Jake had chosen the location carefully, then spent years upgrading it. To the casual observer, it looked like a typical mountain retreat. To someone who knew what to look for, it was a fortress. A burst of static from her burner phone made her jump. Sarah. Thompson's voice was tight with concern. Satellite shows 2 more vehicles heading up the mountain from the east. They're not taking chances. How many? Thermal imaging shows at least 6 more bodies. These aren't just cartel soldiers. They're Ramirez's personal death squad. The ones Jake called Los Fantasmas, Sarah finished. The ghosts, elite killers trained by ex-military contractors. Jake had spent 2 years building cases against them, but they were shadows. No photos, no prints, just bodies left in their wake. Sarah, maybe we should call in the National Guard. These guys, no. Her voice was steel. Bring your team, but keep the circle small. You know what happened last time we involved too many agencies. The betrayal that had cost Jake his life. Someone inside the task force had sold them out, and they'd never identified the leak. That's why Jake had insisted on the cabin, on all the preparations. Trust no one except Thompson, he'd made her promise, and even then, verify. Sarah killed the phone as her headlights caught the reflection of eyes in the darkness. A mountain. Lion watching her passage with predatory interest. The sight triggered another memory. Jake teaching her to track, to read signs, to think like a hunter instead of prey. The difference between a survivor and a victim, he'd said, is understanding that fear is just another tool in your arsenal. The cabin was less than 20 minutes away now. Sarah did a quick mental inventory of the supplies cached there. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, enough food and water for a month-long siege. The reinforced walls concealed steel plate armor. The windows were ballistic glass. The perimeter, a shot cracked through the night. The bullet punching through her rear window with surgical precision. They were trying to take out her tires, disable the vehicle without risking a fatal crash that might deny them their prize. Sarah stomped. The accelerator, muscle memory taking over as she began evasive maneuvers. The truck slalomed across the dirt road, making it impossible to get a clean follow-up shot. Another lesson from Jake. Unpredictability keeps you alive. Through the night vision monocular, she spotted their positions. 2 shooters on the ridgeline, using the elevation to their advantage. The SUV had dropped back, probably coordinating with the new arrivals Thompson had warned about. They were trying to herd her, but not toward the cabin. Think, she whispered to herself, what would Jake do? The answer came with crystal clarity. Jake wouldn't run to the cabin. That's what they'd expect, what they'd planned for. No, Jake would... Sarah yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck off the main road onto a nearly invisible game trail. The suspension screamed in protest as she bounced through a dry creek bed, but she kept her foot down. She wasn't heading for the cabin anymore. She was heading for the old mine shaft. The abandoned copper mine had been one of Jake's backup positions, stocked with a smaller cache of supplies and equipment. More importantly, it offered something the cabin didn't, options. The mine honeycombed the entire mountain, and Jake had mapped every tunnel, every collapse, every possible route in and out. Always have an exit strategy, his voice echoed in her memory. Better yet, have 3. Another shot rang out, closer this time. They'd adjusted quickly to her change in direction. Definitely Los Fantasmas. Regular cartel soldiers wouldn't have adapted so fast. Sarah's phone crackled again. "What the hell are you doing?" Thompson demanded. "The cabin is exactly where they want me to go." Sarah guided the truck through a particularly rough stretch of terrain. How many vehicles are up there now? A pause. Satellite shows 4. They've got the cabin surrounded, Sarah. Full tactical deployment. Good. She allowed herself a grim smile. That means they don't know about the mine. The mine? Jesus, Sarah, that place is a death trap, only if you don't know it like we do. Sarah caught movement ahead, another vehicle trying to cut her off, but she knew something they didn't. How far out are you? 90 minutes. Sarah, please. Get here when you can. And David, if this goes wrong. The thumb drive in Jake's gun safe. It has everything. Names, dates, accounts, everything they killed him to protect. She ended the call before he could respond. The truck crested a small rise, and Sarah saw it. The old mining road, barely visible in the gloom. To her pursuers, it would look like a dead end. A desperate mistake by a panicked target. They didn't know about the reinforced garage hidden in the hillside or the arsenal it contained. They didn't know about the tunnel system that could let a single defender hold off an army. They didn't know that every approach was pre-sighted, every angle covered by carefully hidden cameras and sensors. Most importantly, they didn't know that Sarah Matthews, the quiet schoolteacher who read stories to third graders, had spent countless hours in those tunnels with Jake, learning every inch, every shadow, every tactical advantage. Another shot pierced the night, this one taking out her driver's side mirror. Sarah didn't flinch. The scared teacher was gone, replaced by something else, something forged in the fire of loss and tempered by 3 years of waiting for this. Moment ahead, the mining road disappeared into a wall of rock. To her pursuers, it would look like she'd trapped herself. Sarah touched Jake's ring one last time and whispered, "Time to teach these boys a lesson, cowboy." Then she gunned the engine and drove straight at the rock face, letting muscle memory guide her hands as she aimed for a spot that looked exactly like all the others, except for the carefully concealed garage door that would open at her trucks. Approach! The night erupted in gunfire behind her, but it was too late. Sarah Matthews, widow of the legendary Jake Matthews, was done running. Now it was time to show Ramirez's men why crossing a Matthews was considered suicide in 3 states. The real hunt was about to begin. The hidden garage door slid open with a whisper. Another of Jake's modifications. Hydraulic systems instead. Of chains, soundproofed mechanisms that wouldn't echo through the mountains. Sarah guided her truck inside just as another burst of gunfire lit up the night behind her. The door closed with the same ghostly silence, plunging her into complete darkness. She sat for a moment, letting her eyes adjust and her hands stop shaking. The familiar scent of gun oil and old wood filled her nostrils. They'd spent so many weekends here, Jake teaching her the layout blindfolded until she could navigate it in her sleep. "The dark is your friend," he'd said. "Own it, use it." Sarah reached under the passenger seat and retrieved a small duffel bag, her go bag that had resided there since Jake's death. Inside was everything she needed. Tactical clothing, combat boots, the custom shoulder holster Jake had given her for their first anniversary. The sound of vehicles outside spurred her into motion. She changed quickly, muscle memory taking over, as she strapped on the holster and checked her equipment. The comfortable sundress and teaching clothes were tucked away. They belonged to a different life, a different Sarah. A quick check of the garage's security monitors showed 4 vehicles, converging on her position. Night vision footage revealed 8 figures moving tactically through the darkness, their movements precise and coordinated. Los Fantasmas lived up to their reputation. Sarah moved to the back of the garage, where a massive tool chest stood against the wall. To anyone else, it would look like standard mining equipment, but when she pressed her thumb against a seemingly random spot and whispered, "Remember Juarez," the entire unit slid silently aside. The armory behind it would have made a Special Forces team envious. Racks of weapons lined the walls, each one cleaned and maintained during her weekend hiking trips. She selected Jake's favorite CQB setup, a suppressed MP5, a pair of Glock 19s with custom triggers, and enough magazines to start a small war. The radio scanner on the wall crackled to life, intercepting the cartel team's communications. No sign of entrance or exit. The road ends here. Check the rocks. She has to be somewhere. Thermal's useless. Too much residual heat from the day. Spread out. Find me that bitch. Ramirez wants proof of death by sunrise. Sarah allowed herself a cold smile as she loaded. Magazines. They had thermal imaging and night vision, but they didn't have the one thing that mattered: desperation. She wasn't fighting for revenge or money. She was fighting for survival, for the life she'd built, for the memory of a man who'd died protecting what was right. She moved to the computer terminal hidden behind another false panel. The mine's security system came to life. Cameras, motion sensors, and the network of speakers Jake had installed throughout the tunnels. He'd called it his ghost protocol, a way to confuse and terrify intruders using sound and misdirection. Remember, Jake's voice echoed in her memory. They're expecting a terrified widow. Use that. Make them overconfident. Make them sloppy. Sarah checked the tunnel map one last time, though she knew it by heart. 3 main passages branched from the garage, each leading to different parts of the mine complex. The eastern tunnel had a collapsed section that created a perfect choke point. The western tunnel led to the ventilation shaft that could serve as an emergency exit, and the central tunnel. She touched the detonator in her pocket. The central tunnel was her trump card, rigged with enough explosives to bring down half the mountain. A last resort that Jake had insisted on after Juarez. Thermal sweep complete, a voice crackled over the scanner. No heat signatures in the rock face. She has to be here somewhere. Spread out, check every crevice. She's not leaving this mountain alive. Sarah took a deep breath and keyed the microphone that connected to the tunnel speaker system. Time to begin. The psychological warfare that Jake had taught her was often more effective than bullets. Gentlemen, her voice echoed through the darkness outside, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'm going to give you one chance to walk away, more than you gave Jake. The radio chatter stopped. In the security feeds, she watched them freeze, weapons swinging wildly as they tried to locate the source of her voice. The teacher dies tonight, someone finally responded, a voice with the hard edge of a professional killer. The question is whether it's quick or we take our time. Sarah's finger moved to another button, the one that would activate the first set of charges Jake had hidden in the outer rocks. Not enough to cause a cave-in, but enough to remind them that they weren't the only ones who came prepared. Quick or slow, she replied, letting ice creep into her voice. Dead is dead. Ask your friends in Juarez. The explosion that followed was perfectly calculated, close enough to shower them with rocks, far enough to avoid casualties. A warning shot, Jake would have called it. Through the cameras, she watched chaos erupt. 2 of the men were down, not from injury but from diving for cover. The others had scattered, their formation broken. First blood to her. Sarah checked her watch. 1 hour until Thompson arrived with backup. Time to show these professionals why Jake had called her his best student. She shouldered the MP5, checked her spare magazines one last time, and whispered, a quiet prayer, not for protection, but for the strength to do what needed to be done. Then, Sarah Matthews, the widow who had learned to shoot before she learned to teach, stepped into the darkness of the mine tunnels. Behind her, the hidden door, sealed shut with a soft click that sounded like destiny. The mine tunnels wrapped around Sarah like an old friend's embrace. The darkness that would have terrified others felt like armor, each shadow a potential ally. Her night vision goggles revealed the path ahead in shades of green, but she barely needed them. 3 years of maintaining these tunnels had burned every turn, every alcove, into her muscle memory. Above, she could hear the cartel team regrouping after her explosive warning. Their boots scraped against rock as they searched for an entrance, their frustration evident in their radio chatter. "Nothing here, just solid rock. Keep looking." The explosion came from somewhere. Maybe she trapped herself inside, eh? Save us the trouble. Sarah moved silently through the eastern tunnel, her MP5 at low ready. The first junction lay ahead, a natural cavern that Jake had modified into what he called a fatal funnel. The ceiling was rigged with motion-sensitive lights that could be triggered remotely, bright enough to blow out night vision equipment. The floor contained pressure plates that would seal the emergency blast doors, but Sarah hadn't survived this long by being predictable. Instead of setting up an ambush there, she passed through, heading deeper into the complex. The real trap lay 3 turns ahead. Her earpiece crackled, Thompson's secure channel. "Sarah, we've got problems. Local police picked up cartel radio traffic. They're sending reinforcements." "How many?" A whisper barely disturbed the air. 2 more teams, professional contractors, ex-military. They're bringing heavy equipment, breaching charges, ground-penetrating radar. Sarah processed this as she moved. Time frame: 30 minutes tops. Sarah, they're not just coming to kill you. They want to collapse the entire mine system, bury everything Jake knew. A distant explosion echoed through the tunnels. They'd found one of the secondary entrances. "Right on schedule. Let them come," Sarah replied, touching the detonator in her pocket. "I've got surprises of my own." She reached the 3rd junction and began her preparations. This cavern was special. Jake had spent months modifying it. The walls were honeycombed with hidden passages, allowing a single defender to appear to be in multiple places at once. The acoustics were carefully crafted to distort sound, making it impossible to pinpoint the source of gunfire. Sarah pulled a small remote from her tactical vest and pressed a sequence of buttons. Throughout the mine, hidden speakers came to life, broadcasting the sound of movement, of whispered conversations, of weapons being readied. The Ghost Protocol, Jake's masterpiece of psychological warfare. Through her tactical headset, she could hear the cartel team's confusion. "Movement ahead, no, behind us." "How many are in here?" Impossible. Thermal only showed 1 heat signature. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile as she moved to her first firing position. Jake had trained her to use every advantage, to turn her opponent's strengths into weaknesses. Their tactical gear, their thermal imaging, their military training, all useless in an environment designed to negate them. The first team entered the tunnel system cautiously, their weapons sweeping the darkness. 4 men moved in tactical formation, but their spacing was too tight for the confined space. Amateurs playing at being professionals. Through her night vision, Sarah counted their weapons: MP7s, sidearms, flashbangs. Standard close-quarters loadout. She keyed her radio. "I'll give you one last chance to walk away. Ask yourselves if Ramirez's money is worth dying for." Their response was predictable. A burst of automatic fire that echoed uselessly through the tunnels. Sarah watched as the muzzle flashes ruined their night vision, forcing them to switch to weapon-mounted, lights that made them perfect targets. "Wrong answer," she whispered, and pressed another button on her remote. The Ghost Protocol shifted into high gear. Speakers hidden throughout the complex began broadcasting in sequence, footsteps approaching from multiple directions, the sound of rounds being chambered, whispered commands in military jargon. The cartel team's formation began to break down as they tried to track phantom threats. "Contact front, 9 o'clock. Watch your 6. Sarah moved silently through her hidden passage to a new firing position. The tactics were Jake's, drilled into her over countless training sessions. Make them fight ghosts while you become one. So the team split up, their first fatal mistake. 2 men moved deeper into the tunnel, while 2 held position at the junction. Sarah clicked her radio twice, broadcasting a burst of static that echoed from multiple speakers. The team's heads snapped toward the sound, weapons following. "Remember what I taught you about tunnel fighting?" Jake's voice filled her memory. "Sound is a weapon. Light is a weapon. Fear is a weapon." Sarah reached into her vest and removed a small cylinder, not a grenade, but a custom device Jake had designed. When triggered, it would create a cascade of echoes that would seem to come from everywhere at once. She rolled it into the tunnel junction. The effect was immediate and devastating. The sound of automatic fire filled the space, seemingly coming from all directions. The cartel team opened up blindly, burning through magazines as they fired at shadows. Their weapon lights created a disco effect of moving shadows that only added to the confusion. Through it all, Sarah remained motionless, in her hidden alcove, counting rounds, waiting for the perfect moment. Jake's voice guided her. "Patience. Let them make the mistakes. Let them give you the opening." When it came, it was a textbook. The two rear guards, spooked by the phantom gunfire, backed directly into her line of fire. Their tactical vests would stop most rounds, but Jake had taught her to aim for the gaps. 2 3-round bursts, precisely placed. Both men went down before they could cry out. Sarah was moving before they hit the ground, sliding through another hidden passage as their partners finally realized something was wrong. "Carlos? Miguel? Report!" Sarah triggered another sound cascade, this time broadcasting the dying gasps of men caught in a crossfire. The psychological effect was devastating. She could hear the remaining team members shouting into their radios, demanding backup. "Multiple hostiles! We need—" Her MP5 barked twice more. 2 more bodies hit the ground. Sarah moved quickly, retrieving their weapons and radios. No chances, no loose ends. Jake had taught her to be thorough. "Team 1, report." The command channel crackled with urgency. "What's your status?" Sarah keyed their radio, pitching her voice low and cold. "Team 1 is learning why Jake Matthews' widow was off limits. Would you like to join their lesson?" The silence that followed was profound. She could almost feel the shock rippling through their command structure. They'd come expecting to find a scared schoolteacher. Instead, they'd found something else, something that had learned from one of the deadliest lawmen in Southwest history. Her earpiece crackled again. Thompson's channel. "Sarah, breakthrough at the south entrance. Heavy equipment arriving. Ahead of schedule. They're bringing in shaped charges, mining equipment. They're going to try to bring the whole system down." Sarah checked her watch. 40 minutes until Thompson's team arrived. Not enough time to play it safe anymore. She touched Jake's ring through her tactical vest and whispered, "Time to stop being a ghost and become a nightmare." Then she moved deeper into the darkness, toward the sound of approaching boots and the whine of power tools. The cartel was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one they thought was prey. The real bloodletting was about to begin. Sarah moved through the tunnel system like a wraith, her movements precise and deliberate. The weight of the MP5 in her hands was familiar. How many hours had she spent with Jake, learning to handle it until it felt like an extension of her body? Movement at the south entrance. The cartel's radio traffic was growing more frantic. Heavy equipment in position, standing by for breach. Through the mine's camera system, Sarah watched as they set up their equipment. They had industrial cutting tools, plasma torches, shaped charges, enough hardware to crack open a bank vault. But the mine's entrance wasn't just rock. Behind the natural stone lay layers of reinforced steel and concrete, another of Jake's. Paranoid precautions that now seemed prophetic. Her earpiece crackled. "Sarah," Thompson's voice was tense. "Satellite shows vehicles heading up from the south, different configuration than the cartel teams." "Contractors," Sarah replied, moving to a new position. "Ramirez is hiring muscle." "How can you be sure?" "Because that's what I would do. Sarah checked her ammunition. Send professionals to find me, then bring in the heavy hitters to finish the job. Jake taught me to think like them. A new voice cut across the cartel's command channel. Older, calmer, carrying the weight of authority. This is Xavier. All units hold position. We're doing this my way now. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Xavier Ramirez, Cesar's younger brother, the cartel's master strategist, the man who had orchestrated the ambush that killed Jake. Senora Matthews. His voice switched to the general channel, meant for her ears. I know you can hear me. Let's be professional about this. Sarah stayed silent, moving through the shadows as his voice echoed through the tunnels. Your husband was a worthy opponent. He died well, fighting, defiant to the end. I respected that. A pause. You could have the same dignity. Or we can bring down this entire mountain. Your choice. Sarah reached another junction and began setting up her next surprise. Jake had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a carefully planned offense. Still trying to sound reasonable, Xavier? She kept her voice cold as she worked. Like you were reasonable in Juarez, when you burned those children alive rather than let Jake rescue them. A longer pause. When Xavier spoke again, the false civility was gone. Those children were merchandise, property, like you will be before I let you die. Sarah finished her preparations and moved to the next position. You should have learned from Juarez, Xavier. Some lines you don't cross. She triggered the remote detonator. The explosion wasn't large, but it was precisely placed. The shaped charge, hidden in the tunnel ceiling, brought down several tons of rock, not on the cartel teams, but between them, splitting their forces. Now she could deal with them in smaller, more manageable groups. Chaos erupted over the radio channels as the dust settled. Sarah was already moving, using the confusion to her advantage. The next phase required perfect timing. Breach team status. Xavier's voice carried an edge of panic. Cut off! The tunnel, it's blocked! Hold position. All units, maintain. Sarah triggered the next set of charges. Not explosives this time, but flashbangs connected to motion sensors. The strobing light and concussive force, amplified by the tunnel walls, would be devastating to anyone caught in the kill zone. Through her tactical headset, she heard the screams. Her night vision showed 3 figures stumbling, disoriented. Their expensive tactical gear, designed for traditional combat, worked against them in the confined space. The blast-proof helmets trapped the concussion, multiplying its effect. The heavy body armor restricted movement in the tight tunnels. Remember, Jake's voice whispered in her memory, superiority of equipment means nothing without superiority of position. Sarah engaged methodically, just as she'd been trained. 3 round bursts, center mass. The heavy body armor could stop the rounds, but the kinetic impact in the confined space was enough to incapacitate. As they fell, she switched to carefully. Placed follow-up shots. No chances, no mercy, not after Juarez. Teams 2 and 3 converge on her position. Xavier was shouting now. Use the breaching charges. Bring it all down. Senor Ramirez, the structural integrity. I don't care. Kill her, kill... The radio went dead as Sarah triggered the mine signal jammers. Another gift from Jake. Military-grade electronic warfare equipment that would cut them off from communication and coordination. Her earpiece crackled. Thompson's secure channel still worked on a different frequency. Sarah, we're 30 minutes out. State Police SWAT is with us. Hang on. Negative. Sarah moved to her next position, checking her weapons. If they breached the main structure, the whole system could collapse. We end this now. She reached into her vest and removed Jake's old silver pocket watch. He'd carried it through 15 years of hunting cartel killers, right up until his last day. The inscription inside was worn, but legible. Justice without mercy is tyranny. Mercy without justice is surrender. Time to finish what you started, cowboy, she whispered. The watch went back into her vest as she readied her weapons. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Xavier Ramirez was realizing that his carefully planned trap had become a killing ground. That the quiet schoolteacher he'd dismissed as an easy target was something else entirely. Sarah touched the detonator that would trigger the mine's final defense. Enough explosives to bring down the entire mountain. A last resort that she prayed she wouldn't need. Then she moved into the darkness, toward the sound of breaching charges being set, toward the man who had taken Jake from her, toward an ending that had been 3 years in the making. The ghosts of Juarez were waiting to be avenged. The rhythmic thud of breaching charges echoed through the mine system, each blast sending tremors through the rock. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, using the vibrations to mask her movement. The dust hanging in the air worked to her advantage, creating a natural smoke screen that her night vision equipment could penetrate, but their thermal imaging couldn't. "Find her!" Xavier's voice carried through the tunnels, stripped of its earlier false civility. "I want her alive! She needs to suffer like her husband suffered." Sarah checked her map display, a micro-LED screen mounted on her wrist, showing the mine's layout. The cartel teams had split into 3 groups, one at the main entrance with the breaching equipment, one trying to circle through the western tunnels, and one holding position with Xavier in the central chamber. A rookie mistake. Jake's voice echoed in her memory. Never split your forces in unfamiliar territory. That's how you end up fighting ghosts. Her tactical headset crackled. Thompson's channel. "Sarah, State Police SWAT is 20 minutes out. They're bringing negotiators." "There's nothing to negotiate." Sarah's voice was ice. Xavier was there in Juarez. He watched those children burn and laughed. Some debts can only be paid one way. She moved deeper into the tunnel system, toward the western team. They were moving too fast, too confident. They hadn't noticed the subtle marks on the walls, phosphorescent paint visible only through night vision, marking trigger points for Jake's traps. The first team member crossed the line without seeing it. Sarah pressed a button on her remote. Compressed air hissed through hidden pipes. The tunnel floor dropped away, not far, just 8 inches, but enough to shatter ankles and throw off balance. The cartel team tumbled, their curses echoing through. The darkness. Sarah was moving before they hit the ground. The MP5 barked twice, short, controlled bursts. 2 bodies stopped moving. The third tried to bring his weapon up but found only darkness. The fourth managed to trigger his radio. "Contact! Western Tunnel! She's—" The transmission cut off as Sarah's bullet found him, 4 more down. But the radio transmission had given away her position. "All units converge on the Western Tunnel." Xavier was moving now, his frustration evident. "Use the breaching charges. Bring down the whole mountain if you have to." Sarah was already gone, sliding through a maintenance shaft that would take her behind their position. Another of Jake's modifications. The entire mine was honeycombed with secret passages, maintenance tunnels, and emergency exits. To anyone else, it was a maze. To Sarah, it was a weapon. She emerged behind Xavier's position just as another blast shook the tunnel system. Through her night vision, she could see them setting charges at key structural points. They were getting desperate, willing to risk a cave-in to flush her out. "Remember Juarez," Xavier's voice echoed through the darkness. "Remember how your husband begged at the end, how he broke when we showed him the videos of the children burning." Sarah felt rage surge through her veins, hot and deadly. But Jake's training held. "Anger makes you stupid," he taught her. "Channel it, use it, but never let it control you." She triggered another set of traps. Water pipes hidden in the walls burst with precisely calculated force. The freezing mountain water would play havoc with their thermal imaging, creating false signatures everywhere. "Boss!" One of the cartel members was panicking now. "The sensors are useless. There's heat signatures everywhere." "She's hunting us," another voice added, "like animals." "She's one woman." Xavier's composure was cracking. "One stupid teacher playing at being a soldier. Find her," Sarah allowed, herself a cold smile as she moved to her next position. If only they knew how many hours she'd spent in these tunnels with Jake, learning every inch, preparing for exactly this scenario. A defender who knows their ground, Jake had taught her, is worth 10 attackers who don't. She reached another junction and began her next phase. From hidden speakers throughout the tunnel system, she broadcast Jake's voice, recordings from their training sessions, edited to create an eerie effect. Remember the basics. Watch your corners. Death comes from above. The psychological impact was immediate. The cartel team's radio discipline broke down completely as Jake's ghost seemed to surround them, taunting them from the darkness. Santa Maria, one of them, was praying now. It's his ghost, the ghost of Matthews. Xavier's response was predictable, a burst of automatic fire into the darkness. Shut up. She's playing with your mind. She's just a teacher, just a woman. Just a teacher? Sarah's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Jake taught me everything he knew, Xavier. Everything, including what really happened in Juarez. She triggered another set of charges. Small, focused explosions that collapsed specific tunnel sections. Not to kill, but to isolate. To split them further. To make them easier to hunt. You want to know what Jake's last words really were? Sarah moved through the darkness like a wraith. He told me about the ledger. The one you kept in Juarez. The one with all the names. The corrupt officials. The dirty cops. The politicians. On your payroll. Through her tactical display, she watched Xavier's heat signature spike. Fear, real fear. He didn't beg Xavier. He laughed. Because he knew I'd find it. Knew I'd use it. Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. The breaching team had reached a critical support column. Warning lights flashed on Sarah's wrist display. Structural integrity was reaching critical levels. Her earpiece crackled. Sarah! Thompson's voice was urgent. The whole mountain's becoming unstable. The SWAT team's 10 minutes out, but it'll be over by then. Sarah checked her weapons one last time. One way or another, she moved toward the central chamber, where Xavier's heat signature pulsed like a beacon of rage and fear. Around him, his remaining men were bunched too close, making themselves perfect targets. You hear that, Xavier? Sarah's voice echoed through the tunnels again. That's the sound of your world collapsing, just like in Juarez, but this time there's nowhere to run. Another blast shook the mountain. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling. On her wrist display, red warnings flashed urgently. The entire system was becoming unstable. Sarah touched Jake's ring through her tactical vest one last time. Then, she moved toward the final confrontation, toward the man who had taken everything from her, toward an ending written in blood and justice. The ghosts of Juarez were about to claim another soul. Sarah's tactical display flashed another warning. The tunnel system's structural integrity was reaching critical levels. The cartel's breaching charges had compromised key support points, and the mountain itself seemed to groan under the stress. Through her headset, she could hear Xavier directing his remaining forces. Plant charges on all the main supports. If she won't come out, we'll bury her with her precious husband's memories. A new voice cut through the radio chatter, younger, uncertain. Sir, the structural analysis, if we blow those supports, the whole mountain could... Did I ask for your opinion? Xavier's rage was palpable. Plant the charges. Now! Sarah checked her ammunition. 3 magazines for the MP5, 2 for each Glock. More than enough for what was coming. Jake's voice whispered in her memory. It's not about how many rounds you have. It's about making each one count. Her earpiece crackled. Thompson's secure channel. Sarah, thermal imaging shows they're planting demolition charges on the main support columns. If they detonate those, the whole system comes down. Sarah moved through a maintenance shaft, positioning herself above Xavier's group. How long? Until SWAT arrives. 8 minutes. But Sarah, they're bringing negotiators. They want to end this peacefully. Sarah touched the detonator in her pocket. the one connected to Jake's final failsafe. Peace died in Juarez, David. You know that better than anyone. Through her night vision, she watched Xavier's team working. They were scared now, jumping at shadows, weapons sweeping wildly at every echo. The Ghost Protocol had done its job, wearing down their nerves, making them see threats in every shadow. She keyed her radio, broadcasting through the tunnel system. Tell them about the children, Xavier. Tell them how they screamed. The effect was electric. Xavier's men froze, their movements becoming jerky, uncertain. Even through the thermal imaging, she could see their fear. Tell them how you laughed while they burned. Tell them what you said. To Jake before you shot him. Shut up. Xavier fired a burst into the darkness, his composure finally cracking. You know nothing. You're nothing. Just a teacher playing at being a warrior. Sarah triggered another set of speakers, playing the recording she'd waited 3 years to use. Jake's voice, captured on his hidden backup recorder in his final moments. You think this ends with me, Xavier? My wife. She's better than I ever was. Smarter, more patient, and now she knows everything about Juarez, about the ledger, about the senators on your payroll. The recording cut off in a burst of static and gunfire. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear Xavier's breathing. Rapid, panicked. That's impossible, he whispered. We destroyed the recorder. We checked his body. Jake was thorough. Sarah moved to another position, staying ahead of their searching lights. He had backups for his backups, dead man switches, time-delayed uploads. All that evidence scattered across servers worldwide, just waiting for the right moment. She triggered another set of charges, small ones this time, designed to drive them toward the central chamber, like herding cattle to the slaughter. Your empire is already crumbling, Xavier. Started the moment you killed Jake. Every month, another piece of evidence emerges. Another corrupt judge was exposed. Another dirty cop was arrested. Through her tactical display, she watched their heat signatures bunch together. Classic. Stress response. Seeking safety in numbers. Making themselves perfect targets. You're lying. Xavier's voice cracked. We would have found, like you found his backup files, his offshore accounts, the satellite footage from Juarez. Sarah's voice echoed from multiple speakers, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Jake spent 15 years hunting cartels. Did you really think he wouldn't have contingency plans? Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. Warning lights flashed across Sarah's display. The western tunnel was starting to collapse. Sarah! Thompson's voice was urgent. SWAT team's 5 minutes out. The geological survey team says the whole mountain's becoming unstable. If those charges go off, make sure they stay clear. Sarah checked her weapons one last time. What's about to happen? They don't need to see it. She moved into position above the central chamber. Xavier and his remaining men, 5 of them now, were clustered near the support column, preparing to plant their final charges. Their movements were hurried, sloppy. Fear had eroded their professional discipline. I can hear your fear, Xavier. Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness. The same fear those children felt in Juarez. The same fear Jake saw in your eyes when he destroyed your operation. When I find you, Xavier's voice was thick with rage, I'm going to take my time, make you suffer like the children suffered? Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. I don't think so. She triggered her last surprise. Not an explosion or a recording, but something far simpler. The maintenance shaft she'd prepared years ago, positioned directly above their location, had been filled with a special compound. At her signal, the chemical reaction began. Thick, heavy smoke began pouring into the chamber. Not tear gas or flashbangs. This was Jake's special mixture. It would react with their thermal imaging equipment, creating false signatures everywhere, rendering their expensive gear worse than useless. What's happening? One of Xavier's men was coughing, panicking. The sensors are going crazy. Hold. Position. Xavier tried to maintain control. She's just one woman, one stupid... Sarah's MP5 barked 3 times in the darkness. 3 bodies hit the ground before the echo faded. The hunt was about to end. Chaos erupted in the smoke-filled chamber. Xavier's remaining men fired blindly into the darkness, their expensive tactical gear now worse than useless. The chemical smoke Sarah had released played havoc with their thermal imaging, creating phantom heat signatures everywhere they looked. "Behind you!" "No, there! Watch your fire!" Sarah moved like a ghost through the chaos, just as Jake had taught her. Each step precise, each movement calculated. Their panic worked to her advantage. They were burning through ammunition, giving away their positions with every muzzle flash. "Hold your fire, you idiots!" Xavier's voice cut through the chaos. "She's playing with us, just like he did." Sarah allowed herself a cold smile as she switched positions. Yes, just like Jake had played with them. Her husband had been a master of psychological warfare, understanding that fear was often more effective than bullets. Through her tactical display, she watched their heat signatures cluster together. Classic stress response. They were backing toward the main tunnel, trying to reach the relative safety of open ground. But that would take them right past. The explosion wasn't large, but in the confined space, it was devastating. Another of Jake's tricks, a shaped charge designed to disorient rather than kill. The blast wave, reflected off the tunnel walls, hit them like a hammer. 2 more of Xavier's men went down, clutching their heads as their eardrums ruptured. The expensive tactical helmets they wore, designed to protect against conventional explosions, actually amplified the specialized frequency. Jake had calculated years ago. "Sarah!" Thompson's voice crackled through her secure channel. "SWAT team's 3 minutes out. The geological survey team is picking up critical stress readings. The whole mountain's becoming unstable." She keyed her radio once, their prearranged signal, meaning she'd heard but would proceed anyway. Some debts could only be paid in blood. "Do you know what Jake's last words really were, Xavier?" Sarah's voice echoed from multiple speakers, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. "After you shot him, after your brother put that knife in his back." Through her night vision, she watched Xavier spin wildly, trying to track her voice. His remaining guard stayed close, but his weapon movements were jerky, unprofessional. Fear had eroded his training. He laughed. Sarah moved to her next position, laughed because he knew what was coming. "I knew what I would do when I found his message." "You're lying." Xavier fired another burst into the darkness. He died begging, crying like those children in Juarez. Sarah triggered another set of charges, not explosives this time, but flashbangs connected to motion sensors. The strobing light, amplified by the smoke, created a disorienting strobe effect. In her night vision, she watched Xavier's last guard stumble, vomiting inside his tactical mask. 2 quick shots ended his suffering. "It's just you and me now, Xavier." Sarah moved through the shadows, like it was just you and Jake in Juarez, before your brother stabbed him in the back. "My brother?" Xavier's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "My brother died screaming." Matthews made sure of that. "Yes, he did." Sarah's voice was ice. "Right after he uploaded the ledger, the one with all the names, all the accounts, everything you tried so hard to hide." She watched Xavier's heat signature spike. Fear, real fear. "You're bluffing. We destroyed the obvious copies, the ones you found on his body." Sarah circled closer. Jake was thorough. Dead man switches, time-delayed uploads. Did you really think he wouldn't have backup plans? Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. The breaching charges they'd planted earlier were destabilizing the entire mountain. Warning lights flashed across Sarah's tactical display. Structural integrity was reaching critical levels. "Sarah!" Thompson's voice was urgent. "The whole system's about to collapse. You need to get out now." But Sarah was already moving, closing the distance to Xavier. Through her night vision, she could see him clearly now, the man who had ordered Jake's death, who had laughed while children burned, who had thought a quiet schoolteacher would be easy prey. "Your empire's already falling, Xavier." Sarah's voice came from directly behind him. Started the moment Jake died. Every month another piece of evidence emerges, another corrupt judge exposed, another dirty cop arrested. Did you think that was random? Xavier spun, firing blindly, but Sarah was already gone, moving through the hidden passages Jake had built into the walls themselves. "Look at your phone," she commanded. "The one you think is secure. Check your accounts." She watched, through her tactical display, as Xavier fumbled with his phone, his movements frantic. The color drained from his face as he saw what she'd arranged. Timed releases orchestrated by Thompson, hitting every account simultaneously. "Impossible!" his voice cracked. "These accounts were ghosts, untraceable." Jake was hunting cartels, while you were still running street corners. Sarah's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Those accounts, he found them years ago. Just waited, planned, like I've been planning for the last 3 years. Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling. The mountain itself seemed to groan under the stress. "It's over, Xavier." Sarah emerged from the shadows, MP5 trained on his chest. "The money's gone. The evidence is public. Your empire died with Jake. You just didn't know it yet." Xavier raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking. Fear had replaced the arrogance in his eyes. "You're just a teacher," he whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I'm Jake Matthews' widow." Sarah's voice was steel. "And you're the man who killed him." The mountain chose that moment to scream, a deep, grinding sound of rock under ultimate stress. The breaching charges had finally compromised the main support columns. "Sarah," Thompson's voice was frantic, "the whole system's coming down. Get out now." But Sarah stood her ground, weapon trained on Xavier's heart. In her tactical display, red warnings flashed urgently. Total structural failure imminent. "Shoot me then," Xavier snarled, raising his weapon. "Finish it!" Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of planning, 3 years of remembering Jake's broken body, of hearing children's screams in her nightmares. But Jake's voice whispered in her memory. The difference between justice and vengeance. Justice lets you look in the mirror afterward. The mountains screamed again. Chunks of rock began falling around them. Sarah made her decision. "Drop the weapon, Xavier." Her voice carried the same quiet authority she used with unruly third graders. "You've lost enough men today." Xavier's response was a burst of automatic fire that sparked off the rocks behind her previous position. But Sarah was already moving, sliding through the shadows like smoke. Jake's training took over. 3 steps, pivot, return fire. Her bullets struck with surgical precision, disarming but not killing. Xavier's weapon clattered to the ground along with a spray of blood from his wounded hand. He fell to his knees, clutching his shattered fingers, his facade of control finally cracking. "Just do it," he screamed into the darkness. "Finish it like your husband would have." Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. The mountains groaning grew louder, a deep, primordial sound of stone under impossible stress. On Sarah's tactical display, warning indicators flashed crimson. Total structural failure imminent. "Sarah, for God's sake!" Thompson's voice was desperate now. "The SWAT team's pulling back. The whole mountain's going to come down." But Sarah stood her ground, emerging from the shadows to face Xavier directly. In her night vision, she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she'd seen in Jake's recordings from Juarez, the fear of a predator who suddenly realizes he's become prey. "You want to know the real difference between Jake and me?" Sarah's voice was deadly calm despite the chaos around them. Jake hunted cartels because it was his duty, his job. She took another step forward. "I'm doing this because you made it personal." Xavier tried to scramble backward, but found only solid rock behind him. "You're insane! We'll both die down here." "Maybe." Sarah reached into her tactical vest and removed something. A small USB drive on a chain. But first, you're going to watch everything you built crumble, just like those children watched their world burn in Juarez. She tossed him the drive. That contains the rest of Jake's evidence, the names, the accounts, the videos. By now, Thompson has distributed copies to every major law enforcement agency and news organization in the Western Hemisphere. Xavier stared. At the drive, his face a mask of disbelief. You're lying. This is a trick. Check your phone again. Sarah's voice carried the same patient tone she used to explain math problems to struggling students. While we've been playing cat and mouse down here, Thompson's team has been very busy up there. She watched as Xavier fumbled with his phone. Once more, his injured hand leaving bloody smears on the screen. His eyes widened as he scrolled through message after message. Accounts frozen, properties seized, associates arrested, hidden assets exposed. 3 years. Sarah kept her weapon trained on his chest. 3 years of planning, of waiting, of maintaining my cover as just another small-town teacher. Do you know how many of your people I've identified from my classroom? Parents, relatives, each one giving me another piece of the puzzle. The mountain screamed again. Larger rocks began falling now, forcing them both to dodge. The structural integrity was reaching critical levels. Sarah, Thompson's voice cracked with static. You've got 2 minutes at most. The geological team says. She clicked off the radio. This moment, this reckoning, belonged to her and Xavier alone. You have a choice. Sarah's voice carried over the sound of falling rock. The eastern tunnel is still stable. You might make it out before everything collapses. She paused, letting the words sink in. Or you can try to kill me. Die here, knowing that everything you built, everything you killed for, is already gone. Xavier's laugh was hollow, desperate. And you'll just let me walk away? After what we did to Matthews? To those children? The difference between justice and revenge? Sarah quoted Jake's words. Justice lets you live with the consequences. Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. The support beams groaned. A sound like tortured metal pushed beyond its limits. Through her tactical display, Sarah could see the structural integrity indicators dropping into the red. 1 minute, Thompson's voice crackled through static. Sarah, please. Xavier looked from his wounded hand to his fallen weapon, calculating odds, weighing chances, the predator's instinct warring with survival. Sarah saw the moment his decision crystallized. The subtle shift in posture, the tensing of muscles. Even without Jake's training, she would have recognized it from years of watching schoolyard bullies choose violence over reason. Xavier dove for his weapon. Sarah's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him away from the gun. The second found his knee, ensuring he wouldn't try again. Not kill shots. Jake had taught her that sometimes living with consequences was a harsher punishment than death. That was for the children. Sarah's voice was ice as she stood over him. The ones you couldn't break, the ones Jake saved. The mountain screamed one final warning. The support beams began to buckle. Sarah touched Jake's ring through her tactical vest one last time. Then she made her final choice, one that would have made her husband proud. The real justice was about to begin. The mountain was dying. There was no other way to describe the horrific groaning of rock and metal as the tunnel system began its final collapse. Sarah's tactical display flashed urgent warnings. Structural integrity had dropped below critical levels. They had less than a minute before everything came down. Xavier lay at her feet, blood pooling from his shoulder and knee wounds. His eyes, once filled with arrogant contempt, now showed only fear and confusion as he stared up at the quiet schoolteacher who had dismantled his entire operation. "Finish it!" he spat, blood staining his teeth. "Be like your husband, be a killer!" Sarah's MP5 remained trained on his chest, her finger steady on the trigger. 3 years of planning, of waiting, of remembering Jake's broken body and the children's. Screams from Juarez, all leading to this moment. Sarah! Thompson's voice crackled through static. "The mountain's coming down. Last chance to get out." Through her tactical display, she watched the support beams buckling. The chemical smoke she'd released earlier was thinning, revealing the full extent of the damage their battle had caused. The breaching charges had compromised key structural points, and now the whole system was failing catastrophically. "You don't have the guts," Xavier taunted, though his voice trembled. "You're just a teacher, just a woman playing at—" Sarah's boot connected with his wounded knee, cutting off his words in a scream of pain. When she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority she used to control unruly students. "I'm going to tell you a story, Xavier, a story about choice." She kept her weapon trained on him as rocks began falling around them. 3 years ago, after you killed Jake, I had 2 options. I could become what you are, someone who sees people as things to be broken, or I could become something else. Another explosion rocked the tunnel system. The mountain's groaning grew louder, more urgent. Through her tactical headset, she could hear Thompson ordering the SWAT team to fall back to safe positions. "I chose to teach," Sarah continued, her voice carrying over the chaos, "to help shape young minds, to show them there's always a choice between violence and understanding." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Even now I'm teaching you about consequences." Xavier's laugh was hollow, desperate. "By killing me? By dying here with me? No." Sarah reached down and grabbed his uninjured arm. "By saving your worthless life, with strength born from years of training." She hauled him to his feet. Xavier stumbled, off balance from his wounds, but Sarah's grip was iron. "The eastern tunnel is still stable," she said, forcing him to move. "You've got about 40 seconds to decide if your pride is worth dying for." "Sarah." Thompson's voice was frantic now. "The geological team says—" "I know." She clicked off the radio. This moment, this choice, belonged to her alone. They stumbled through the collapsing tunnels, Sarah half dragging Xavier as the mountain died around them. Her night vision showed the path ahead, but it was her intimate knowledge of the mine's layout that kept them alive. Every turn, every junction had been memorized during countless training sessions with Jake. "Why?" Xavier gasped as they rounded another corner, barely avoiding a cascade of falling rocks. "Why not let me die?" "Because Jake believed in justice, not vengeance." Sarah's voice was steel beneath the calm, "and because dying would be too easy. You're going to live, Xavier. Live to face every parent from Juarez. Live to watch everything you built crumble. Live with the knowledge that a school teacher brought down your empire. The tunnel system is failing catastrophically now." Support beams buckled and snapped, the sound like gunshots in the confined space. Sarah's tactical display flashed urgent warnings as the ceiling began to cave in behind them. Through her headset, she could hear Thompson coordinating with the SWAT team, preparing for their emergence. But there was something else in the background, a sound that made her blood run cold. Helicopter rotors. "You hear that?" Xavier's laugh was edged with hysteria. "That's not the police. That's my backup, my real insurance policy." Sarah's mind raced. Of course, the cartel would have contingency plans, teams of mercenaries waiting to extract their leader, to ensure the family's secrets died here. 20 seconds! Thompson's voice cracked through the static. "Sarah, the whole mountain." She made her decision in an instant. Shoving Xavier ahead of her, she reached into her tactical vest and retrieved Jake's final gift, a compact thermite charge designed to seal the tunnel permanently. "Run," she commanded, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. "Run or die here." Xavier stumbled forward, survival instinct finally overriding his pride. Sarah waited until he rounded the final corner before triggering the charge. The thermite ignited with a blinding flash, melting rock and metal, creating an impenetrable barrier between them and whatever waited outside. The mountain's death scream reached a crescendo. Sarah sprinted through the collapsing tunnel, counting Steps in her head, just as Jake had taught her. 3 steps to the junction, 5 to the support beam, 7 to... The world exploded. Sarah dove forward as the ceiling came down behind her. Her tactical gear took the brunt of the impact as she rolled, coming up in a defensive position, just as Jake had drilled into her countless times. They emerged into chaos. Red and blue lights strobed through dust-filled air as the SWAT team secured the area. Above, dark helicopters circled like vultures, cartel gunships waiting for their opportunity. Xavier lay face down in the dirt, already surrounded by SWAT officers. The proud cartel leader had been reduced to what Sarah had always known he was, a bully who broke when faced with real strength. "Sarah!" Thompson ran forward, his face a mask of relief and concern. "The gunships can't do anything." Sarah removed her tactical vest, revealing Jake's badge hanging beneath it. "The evidence is already public. The accounts are frozen. The Empire's fallen." She walked to where Xavier lay and knelt beside him, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "Remember this moment. Remember that you lived because a teacher chose mercy over vengeance. Remember that everything you built fell because you underestimated a widow's patience." Standing, she faced the circling helicopters. Through her tactical headset, she could hear their pilots receiving orders, arguing, finally turning away. Even cartel loyalty had its limits, and there was nothing left here worth dying for. Thompson approached cautiously. "Sarah, the mine is sealed." She touched Jake's ring, still hanging from its chain. "Some ghosts should stay buried." The mountain gave one final groan as the last tunnels collapsed. Dust billowed from the entrance, erasing all traces of the violence that had occurred below. Nature reclaiming its own. "The school board's going to have questions," Thompson said, trying to inject some normality into the surreal scene. Sarah allowed herself a small smile, her first real one in 3 years. "I'll tell them I was dealing with bullies. It's not even a lie." State police vehicles were arriving now, along with FBI and DEA teams, the bureaucracy of justice grinding into motion. But Sarah was already walking away, her teacher's bag slung over one shoulder, looking for all the world like she was simply heading home after a long day at school. "Sarah," Thompson called after her, "what will you do now?" She paused, considering. The weight of the past 3 years, the planning, the waiting, the careful maintenance of her cover, felt lighter somehow. Not gone, but transformed. "I have lesson plans to prepare," she said finally, "and a class full of children who need to learn that strength doesn't always mean violence, that justice doesn't always mean vengeance." She touched Jake's ring one last time, then let it fall beneath. Her blouse, the quiet teacher who had brought down a cartel, the widow who had chosen justice over revenge, the warrior who had found her own way to honor Jake's memory. Behind her, the mountain settled into its new shape, keeping its secrets. Above, the sun began to rise over another school day, in a small town where appearances could be deceiving. Sarah Matthews, third-grade teacher and protector of innocence, walked into the dawn. 1 month later, the morning sun painted Pine Creek Elementary in shades of gold as Sarah Matthews walked through the familiar halls. Summer vacation had ended, bringing with it new faces, new challenges, and new chances to make a difference. Her classroom, once again filled with artwork and educational posters, felt more like home than ever. Miss Matthews, Amy Rodriguez's voice carried down the hallway as her former student ran to greet her. "Did you see the news? They're talking about those bad men you stopped." Sarah knelt down, giving the girl a warm hug. The bruises from the mine had healed, but some muscles still protested the movement. "What did we learn about watching news?" "Stories, Amy. That there's always more than one side," Amy recited dutifully. "And that being strong doesn't mean being scary." "That's my girl." Sarah smiled, seeing Jake's principles living on in the next generation. The past month had been a whirlwind of federal investigations, debriefings, and media attention. Xavier's arrest had triggered a cascade of revelations that shook law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. The evidence Jake had gathered, combined with Sarah's meticulous documentation over the past 3 years, had exposed corruption at every level. Principal Davidson caught up with her as she headed to her classroom. "Sarah, the school board meeting is this afternoon. Are you sure you don't want me to—" "I'll handle it, Tom." Sarah's voice carried the same quiet authority that had faced down cartel killers. "They deserve to hear the truth from me." The truth had become a complex thing. The official story painted her as an undercover federal asset, maintaining her cover while gathering intelligence. It was cleaner that way, neater. The reality of a grieving widow who had chosen to honor her husband's memory through both justice and teaching was messier, more human. Her new class was already seated when she entered, their young faces a mixture of awe and curiosity. The stories had spread, as stories do in small towns, growing with each retelling. Some parents had been concerned about having their children taught by someone with her background. Others had specifically requested her class. "Good morning, everyone." Sarah's teacher's voice filled the room, carrying the warmth that had made her beloved long before her other skills became public knowledge. "Today, we're going to talk about choices." She caught movement at the classroom door. Thompson, wearing his marshal's badge openly now, he gave her a subtle nod before moving on. The protective detail was lighter these days, but still present. The cartel's power had been broken, but old habits died hard. "Miss Matthews?" A small hand rose from the back row. "Is it true you used to be a secret agent?" Sarah smiled, remembering Jake's lessons about truth and consequences. "What I used to be isn't as important as what I am now, and what I am is your teacher." The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm of lessons and learning. Sarah moved through her classroom with the same fluid grace that had served her in the mine, but now it was deployed in service of education rather than survival. Each child represented a chance to shape the future, to ensure that strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. During lunch break, she found herself in the teacher's lounge, where conversation still hushed slightly when she entered. The newspaper on the table carried the headline, "Cartel Empire Crumbles, Mountain Showdown Leads to International Arrests. Sarah." Linda Chen, the 4th-grade teacher, slid a coffee across the table. "The FBI is back. They're asking about the sealed tunnel. They'll keep asking." Sarah sipped her coffee calmly. Some answers need to stay buried. The mine had become something of a legend. Despite the best efforts of federal agencies, the sealed tunnel remained impenetrable. The thermite charge had done its job, protecting not just physical evidence, but also the metaphysical weight of what had happened there. Some stories weren't meant to be fully told. Her phone buzzed. A message from Thompson. "Xavier's talking. Everything. The DA is offering witness protection." Sarah deleted the message without responding. Let Xavier hide. Let him live with the knowledge that his empire had been dismantled not by force of arms, but by the patience of a schoolteacher. Some victories didn't need gunfire. The afternoon sun found her at Jake's grave, as it did every Wednesday. The headstone was simple, bearing only his name and the dates. But Sarah had added something new, a small plaque bearing the words that had guided both their lives. "Justice without mercy is tyranny. Mercy without justice is surrender. You'd be proud," she whispered, touching the familiar stone. "The evidence you gathered, the foundations you laid, it all mattered, but not as much as what you taught me about choice." A small noise made. Her turn, Amy Rodriguez, standing respectfully at the cemetery gate with her mother. The girl held a handful of wildflowers, picked from the schoolyard garden Sarah had helped plant. "Can we—" Amy's voice was hesitant. "Can we put these here for Mr. Matthews?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded. This was Jake's real legacy, not the cartel battles or the federal cases, but the ripples of kindness that spread outward through generations. Miss Matthews? Amy placed the flowers carefully. Those bad men, did they think you were weak because you're a teacher? They did. Sarah knelt beside her student. But that's the thing about strength, Amy. Real. Strength isn't about who can hurt people. It's about who can help them. Later that evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Creek, Sarah sat at her desk, preparing the next day's lessons. Her tactical gear had been stored away, perhaps forever. The hidden arsenal in the cabin would be dismantled piece by piece. The past would remain the past, but Jake's ring still hung around her neck, a reminder that some battles were fought not with bullets, but with patience. Some victories came not from violence, but from wisdom. Some warriors wore teachers' clothes. Her classroom door opened, Thompson looking uncomfortable in his formal uniform. School boards ready, Sarah gathered her materials, lesson plans, documentation, the simple truth about who she was and why she taught. No tactical gear needed for this battle. You know they're scared, Thompson said as they walked. A teacher who can outfight cartel hitmen. Then I'll teach them not to be afraid. Sarah's voice carried the certainty that had brought down an empire. That's what teachers do. The board members were waiting, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Sarah took her seat, arranged her papers, and began to speak. Not about cartels or gunfights or sealed tunnels, but about children and choices, and the kind of strength that builds rather than breaks. Outside, the mountain stood silent against the evening sky, keeping its secrets. Inside, Sarah Matthews, teacher, widow, warrior, continued Jake's real work, showing that the greatest victories come not from the battles we fight, but from the lives we touch. The sun set on Pine Creek, where a quiet teacher had reminded the world that true strength wears many faces, and some heroes carry lesson plans instead of guns. As darkness settled over the town, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, grading papers in the warm glow of her desk lamp. The familiar routine was comforting after the intensity of the board meeting. They had voted unanimously to keep her on staff, though not without heated debate, about security protocols and potential risks to the school. The only risk to these children, she had told them, her teacher's voice carrying absolute conviction, would be teaching them that violence is stronger than wisdom. A soft knock at her door drew her attention. Thompson stood there, looking more relaxed in civilian clothes. Thought I'd find you here, old habits. Jake used to say the same thing. Sarah smiled, gesturing to a chair. He never understood why I'd stay late grading when we had surveillance to maintain. About that. Thompson placed a thick folder on her desk. Final report on the Juarez evidence. 37 convictions so far. Federal judges, state officials, even a senator. Jake's dead man switches worked perfectly. Sarah touched the ring beneath her blouse. He always planned 3 steps ahead. Like someone else I know. Thompson's voice held a mixture of admiration and concern. The cartels are calling you La Maestra now, the teacher. There are stories spreading through the underworld about the school teacher who brought down an empire. Let them tell their stories. Sarah returned to her grading. Fear teaches nothing worth learning. A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the scratch of her red pen on papers. Finally, Thompson spoke again. The FBI still asking questions about the sealed tunnel, about what else might be hidden in there. Some answers aren't found in tunnels. Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes. They're found in classrooms where we teach children that strength comes in many forms. Her phone buzzed, a text from Amy, Rodriguez's mother. She did her homework voluntarily tonight. Said Miss Matthews taught her that knowledge is better protection than guns. Sarah smiled, remembering Jake's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. The best weapon is the one between your ears. The night deepened as she finished her grading. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new chances to shape young minds. The tactical gear stored in her house might never be needed again, but the skills Jake had taught her, patience, strategy, the ability to read people and situations, those would always serve her students. Walking to her car, Sarah paused to look at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. Somewhere in those sealed tunnels lay the last physical remnants of her old life. But the real legacy wasn't buried in rock. It lived in the lessons she taught, in the lives she touched, in the quiet strength she demonstrated every day. Her phone buzzed again, Thompson with an update. Xavier's testimony led to more arrests. The entire southwest corridor is being dismantled. You did it, Sarah. You and Jake both. She drove home through the quiet streets of Pine Creek, past the general store where it had all started that summer afternoon. Joe Miller was closing up, and he gave her a respectful nod as she passed. The town had changed its view of her, but she remained unchanged in her core purpose, to teach, to guide, to show that true power lay not in violence but in wisdom. At home, Sarah found a package waiting on her porch, small, unmarked, but she recognized the handwriting on the label. Inside was Jake's old badge, restored and mounted, with a note from Thompson. He'd want you to have this. You finished his fight, but in your own way. She hung the badge beside her teaching credentials, a symbol of how different paths could lead to the same truth. Then she settled at her kitchen table to prepare for tomorrow's lessons. The topic was everyday heroes, people who chose to make a difference not through force, but through dedication and wisdom. As she wrote her lesson plan, Sarah thought of Jake, of the children from Juarez, of her current students learning that true strength often wore the quietest disguise. Her phone lit up with one final message from Thompson. Security details signing off. You're officially just a teacher again, Sarah smiled, knowing that she had never been just anything. She was a teacher who had brought down a cartel, a widow who had chosen justice over vengeance, a warrior who had found her greatest victories in the classroom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new chances to prove that the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or a badge, but the ability to shape young minds and touch young hearts. Outside, the mountain kept its secrets, and the quiet streets of Pine Creek slept peacefully, protected not by force of arms, but by the watchful eye of a teacher who had proven that the most dangerous predator wasn't always the one with the sharpest claws, but the one with the most patience, wisdom, and heart. Sarah Matthews, third-grade teacher and secret warrior, turned off her kitchen light and prepared for another day of her most important mission, showing the next generation that true strength wasn't found in violence, but in the courage to choose a better way. The night settled over Pine Creek, where a quiet teacher had written a new kind of legend, one taught not with bullets, but with kindness, not with fear, but with wisdom, not with force, but with love. Some battles were won with guns, but the most important victories were won with chalk, patience, and the unwavering belief that every child could learn to be strong without being cruel, brave without being violent, powerful without being destructive. That was Jake's real legacy, and Sarah would honor it, one lesson at a time, in a classroom where true heroes were born not in gunfire, but in moments of quiet courage and everyday grace. 1 year later, the autumn wind swept across Pine Creek Elementary's playground, carrying fallen leaves and children's laughter in equal measure. Sarah Matthews stood at her classroom window, watching her students during recess. A year had passed since the mountain had kept its final secrets, since a quiet teacher had shown the world that true strength often came in unexpected packages. "Miss Matthews!" The call came from Jenny Torres, one of her new third-graders. "Can you help? Tommy and Michael are fighting over the swing set." Sarah smiled, remembering similar conflicts resolved with far deadlier stakes. She moved across, The playground, with the same fluid grace that had once served her in darker places, but now it was deployed in service of peace rather than survival. "Boys!" Her teacher's voice carried just enough authority to freeze them mid-argument. "What did we learn about conflict resolution? That violence is the tool of those who can't think of better solutions," Tommy recited, looking sheepish. The words were Jake's originally, though he'd used them in very different circumstances. Michael nodded, already backing down. "And that. Real strength is knowing when not to use it." Sarah watched them work out a sharing schedule for the swing, proud of how quickly they'd absorbed the lesson. These small victories, turning potential violence into understanding, meant more than all the cartel takedowns in the world. Later that afternoon, as her students worked on their writing assignments, Sarah noticed a familiar figure in her in-classroom doorway. Thompson, now promoted to chief marshal, looked oddly out of place in the cheerful educational setting. "Got a minute?" he asked quietly. They stepped into the hallway, where children's artwork and educational posters had replaced the tactical maps and surveillance photos of her previous life. "Xavier's trial concluded this morning," Thompson said without preamble. "Maximum sentence plus additional charges for the Juarez incident. The evidence you and Jake gathered, it was bulletproof." Sarah nodded, touching the ring that still hung beneath her blouse. "Jake always said the best weapon was documentation. There's more." Thompson handed her a thick envelope. "The FBI finally cleared the last of the sealed records. They're officially closing the case on the mountain incident. You're listed as a civilian consultant who aided in a federal investigation. Keep it simple," Sarah quoted Jake's old advice. "The truth is complicated enough." Inside her classroom, she could hear her students working on their latest project, Ndri's essays about everyday heroes in their community. More than one had chosen to write about their teacher, though not for the reasons most would expect. "They're calling it the biggest cartel takedown in Southwest history," Thompson continued. "Task forces are still following leads from Jake's evidence trails. The whole network is unraveling. And the children from Juarez? All 27 survivors have been placed with families or support programs. The foundation you set up with the seized assets is funding their education." Sarah smiled, remembering Jake's words about true victory. "It's not about who you bring down, it's about who you lift up." The school bell rang, signaling the end of another day. Her students began packing up, each stopping to give her a hug or share a final thought before leaving. These simple interactions meant more to her than any federal commendation. "Miss Matthews?" Little Amy Rodriguez, now in 4th grade, appeared in the doorway. "Can I show you something?" Sarah followed her former student to the school library, where a new display had been set up. "Local Heroes," the banner read, and there, among the firefighters and police officers, was a photograph of Jake in his marshal's uniform. But next to it was something that made Sarah's breath catch. A simple drawing by one of her students showing a teacher standing between her class and shadowy figures, not with a weapon, but with a book held high like a shield. "I drew it," Amy said proudly, "because you taught us that real heroes don't just protect people with force. They protect them with knowledge." Thompson, who had followed them, cleared his throat. "The cartel still tells stories about La Maestra, the teacher who brought down an empire, but they don't understand that the most dangerous thing about you was never your tactical training." "No," Sarah agreed, touching the drawing gently. "The most dangerous thing is the ability to teach others that violence isn't strength. That's what truly terrifies them." Later that evening, Sarah drove up to the mountain overlook where she and Jake had spent so many evenings planning operations. The sealed mine entrance was barely visible now, overgrown with vegetation, nature reclaiming its space. Her phone buzzed, a message from Linda Chen. "Board meeting tomorrow. They want to expand the conflict resolution program you developed. Seems your methods are showing results." Sarah smiled. remembering the skepticism when she'd first proposed teaching children military-grade strategic thinking and conflict resolution techniques, stripped of their violent applications. Now the program is being studied by educators nationwide. Police cruiser pulled up beside her. Officer Rodriguez, Amy's father, doing his evening patrol. "Quiet night, Miss Matthews?" he asked, the respect in his voice carrying an edge of understanding. They both knew what she had done, what she had been capable of, but they also knew what she had chosen to become instead. The best kind, she replied, thinking of her students' essays, their growing understanding that true power lay not in domination, but in wisdom. As she drove home through the darkening streets of Pine Creek, Sarah passed the spots that had once been surveillance posts, dead drops and emergency caches. All gone now, replaced by memories of student achievements, breakthrough moments, and lives touched not through force, but through understanding. At home, she settled into grade papers, essays about heroes, about strength, about choices. Her tactical gear gathered dust in a locked chest, while her lesson plans grew more innovative, more focused on teaching the kind of strength that prevented violence rather than employed it. Her phone lit up one last time. Thompson, again. Final. Casualty reports from the cartel collapse, 157 arrests, 23 convictions, 4 international trafficking networks dismantled, all because a teacher chose to finish what her husband started. But Sarah was already focused on tomorrow's lesson plan. Understanding your strength, not about physical power or tactical advantage, but about the strength to choose wisdom over violence, patience over force, teaching over destroying. Jake's badge still hung beside her teaching credentials, but now it was accompanied by something new. A child's drawing of a classroom, where shadows turned to light, where fear turned to understanding, where strength wore a teacher's smile. Outside, Pine Creek slept peacefully, protected not by weapons or walls, but by something far more powerful. A legacy of wisdom passed from teacher to student, showing that the greatest victories were won not through force of arms, but through force of heart. After the presentation, Sarah found herself surrounded by educators eager to implement the program in their own schools. She answered their questions with the same patience she showed her third graders, knowing that each conversation was a seed planted, each connection a potential for change. "You never told them the whole story," Thompson observed later as they sat in the hotel restaurant. "About Jake, about the mountain, about what really happened that night." "Some lessons," Sarah smiled, "are better taught through example than explanation." Her phone lit up with a series of messages, updates from Pine Creek Elementary, where her original program had grown into something remarkable. The school now hosted regular workshops for educators nationwide, teaching them how to transform conflict into opportunity, fear into understanding. "You know," Thompson mused, "Jake would be proud, not just of what you did that night, but of what you've built since." Sarah thought of her classroom back home, where Jake's badge still hung beside her teaching credentials, but now they were surrounded by awards, recognition not for lives taken, but for lives transformed. "The cartels still tell stories about La Maestra," Thompson continued, "but they don't understand. They think the story ends with the mountain, with Xavier's arrest. They don't see that it was just the beginning." Sarah nodded, remembering the night everything had changed. "The mountain taught me that victory isn't always about who's stronger. Sometimes it's about who's wiser." Her phone buzzed again, a photo from Amy Rodriguez. She'd just been accepted to the teaching program at State University. The caption read, "Following in your footsteps, Miss Matthews," both pairs of them. Later that night, Sarah stood at her hotel window, looking out over the city lights. 5 years had transformed her story from a tale of revenge into something far more powerful, a lesson about the true nature of strength. The sealed mine still kept its secrets, but its real treasure wasn't buried in rock. It lived in classrooms across the country, where children learned that the strongest person in the room wasn't always the one who could fight best, but the one who could find alternatives to fighting. Her laptop chimed, an email from the Justice Department. The last of the Juarez children had graduated high school. The foundation she'd established with the seized cartel assets had funded their education, their therapy, their chance at a new life. Jake's final mission, completed not with bullets but with books. Sarah opened her presentation folder, reviewing tomorrow's workshop materials. Strategic Response in Educational Environments. A fancy title for teaching children the same situational awareness and tactical thinking that had once kept her alive in very different circumstances. A text from Thompson popped up. Just heard. From the FBI, they're using your program in their community outreach, teaching kids to be strong without becoming dangerous. You've started something bigger than you know. She thought of her classroom back in Pine Creek, where next week she'd welcome a new group of third graders. They would never know that their teacher had once brought down a cartel and had once used her skills for violence instead of peace. They would only know her as Miss Matthews, who taught them that true strength came from wisdom, not force. The night deepened, and Sarah prepared her materials for tomorrow's workshops. Each presentation, each conversation, each small interaction was another chance to spread Jake's real legacy. Not the legend of a deadly lawman, but the wisdom of someone who understood that true power lay in the ability to choose peace over violence. Her phone lit up one final time, a message from Amy. Found this in my old papers. Thought you should see it. Attached was a photograph of a child's drawing, 5 years old now, showing a teacher standing between her students and darkness, holding up a book like a shield. Sarah smiled, remembering the day she'd made her choice in the mountain. The day she'd decided that the best way to honor Jake's memory wasn't through vengeance, but through transformation, through taking everything he'd taught her about survival and turning it into lessons about living. Outside her window, the city slept peacefully, unaware that among them walked a warrior who had chosen to trade her weapons for wisdom, her tactical gear for teaching tools, her battlefield for a classroom where the most important victories were won not through force, but through understanding. In her bag, next to her presentation materials, Jake's old silver watch still kept. Perfect time. Its inscription had become the cornerstone of her program. Justice without mercy is tyranny. Mercy without justice is surrender. But she'd added her own line beneath it. Wisdom is knowing how to balance both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to spread these lessons further. But for now, Sarah Matthews, teacher, transformer, bearer of a legacy more powerful than violence, prepared for another day of her most important mission, showing the world that the strongest warriors weren't those who could destroy, but those who could build. The night wrapped around the city like a protective blanket, and somewhere in a small town in the southwest, a sealed mountain kept its secrets, while the real treasure it had protected spread across the nation, one classroom at a time, in lessons about strength and wisdom and the courage to choose a better way. Some legends were written in blood and gunsmoke, but the most important ones were written in chalk and kindness and the quiet victories of peace over violence, of wisdom over force, of teaching over destruction. That was the real story of the teacher who had been underestimated. Not because of what she had done in darkness, but because of what she had chosen to do in light, and in classrooms across the country where children learned to be strong without being cruel, brave without being violent, powerful without being destructive. That story continued to grow, one lesson at a time, in the endless ripples of a choice made in a mountain, where a teacher had proven that the most dangerous force in the world wasn't violence. It was wisdom. The old mountain hadn't changed much in a decade. Nature had reclaimed the sealed mine entrance, covering it with vegetation and time's gentle erasure. But Sarah Matthews still felt its presence as she stood at the overlook, watching the sunset paint Pine Creek in shades of gold and shadow. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years, Thompson said beside her. His hair had gone fully grey now, but his eyes were still sharp as ever. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." Sarah touched the familiar weight of Jake's ring, still hanging from its chain. "Some memories don't fade." They had gathered here, a small group of those who knew the full story, to mark a decade since the night that had changed everything. Amy Rodriguez, now a first-year teacher herself, stood with her father. Linda Chen, recently promoted to principal of Pine Creek Elementary. Even Joe Miller from the general store, old but still standing straight. "The FBI finally closed the last of the Juarez files," Thompson mentioned quietly. "The Foundation's work is officially done. All the children are grown, educated, living their lives." Sarah nodded, thinking of the countless lives touched by what had started here. The Matthews Foundation had grown far beyond its original mission, now funding educational programs nationwide. What had begun as restitution for cartel victims had become a force for transformation. Her phone buzzed, a message from the National Education Board. The conflict resolution program she'd developed had just been adopted by its 1,000th school. 10 years of steady growth, of proving that the skills that could wage war could also forge peace. "Miss Matthews?" Amy stepped forward, holding something. "I found this while cleaning out my old room. Thought you should have it." It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local Teacher Assists Federal Task Force in Major Cartel Takedown." The official story, sanitized and simplified. Below it was Amy's old drawing of a teacher protecting her students with a book instead of a weapon. "You know," Amy said softly, "I teach your methods now. My students ask me where they came from. Sometimes I want to tell them the whole story." Sarah smiled, remembering her own lessons about truth and timing. Some stories are better lived than told. The sun was setting fully now, casting long shadows across the valley where Pine Creek nestled. From here, she could see her classroom window still lit despite the late hour. "Another teacher is working late, preparing tomorrow's lessons." The cycle continues. "They're making a documentary," Thompson mentioned, "about the cartel wars, the Juarez incident, everything that happened. They want to interview you." "Let them tell you their version," Sarah replied. "The real story isn't about cartels or gunfights. It's about choices, about transformation. That's harder to capture on camera." Her phone lit up again, a series of photos from schools across the country participating in the Matthews Method training program. Children learn conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking. The same skills that had once been used for violence, now deployed in service of peace. "You know what Jake would say about all this?" Thompson gestured at the peaceful valley below, about his tactical training being used to teach kids how to avoid fights. Sarah smiled, remembering Jake's favorite saying, "The best victory is the one where no shots are fired." Later that evening, they gathered at Pine Creek Elementary's auditorium for the 10th anniversary celebration of the school's revolutionary program. Educators from across the state had come to see where it all began, though few knew the true catalyst. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out over faces young and old, all touched in some way by what had started in darkness, but bloomed in light. 10 years ago," she began, "this community faced a choice between force and wisdom, between violence and understanding. The choice we made then continues to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond our small town." In the audience, she saw the next generation of teachers, including some of her former students, ready to carry these lessons forward. Among them sat several of the Juarez survivors, now adults with careers and families of their own. the cycle of violence broken, replaced by cycles of growth. The true measure of strength, she continued, isn't in how much damage we can cause, but in how much good we can do. Not in how many battles we win, but in how many we can prevent. Her phone buzzed one final time, a message from the FBI's Community Outreach Division. They were expanding their use of her program, teaching at-risk youth the same principles that had transformed Pine Creek. The ripples spread further, touching more lives. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through her classroom one last time. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter, taking the program national, teaching other educators how to implement these life-changing methods, but her heart would always remain here, where it had all begun. The Matthews method has been implemented in over 10,000 schools worldwide, Sarah continued, but numbers don't tell the real story. The real story lives in every child who learned to choose wisdom over force, in every conflict prevented, in every life transformed. Her phone buzzed silently, a message from the Justice Department. The last of the cartel's old guards had died in prison, taking the final remnants of that dark chapter with them. But their passing was barely a footnote now. The real story had moved far beyond them. The morning sun streamed through the auditorium. Windows, catching the gold of Jake's ring, still hanging from its chain after all these years. Sarah touched it briefly, remembering the man who had taught her that strength came in many forms. People often ask me about that night in the mountain, she told the gathered educators. They want to hear about gunfights and explosions, about cartels and revenge. But the real story isn't about what happened in the darkness. It's about what we chose to build in the light. The Matthews Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a fund for cartel victims had evolved into a global force for educational transformation. Schools on 5 continents now taught children the same principles that had once been military tactics, repurposed for peace. The tools that can wage war, Sarah explained, can also forge understanding. The skills that can take life can also transform it. The choice lies not in what we know, but in how we choose to use that knowledge. After the keynote speech, Sarah walked the familiar halls of her old school. Children's artwork covered the walls, not just from Pine Creek students, but from partner schools around the world. Each piece tells the same story: strength through wisdom, power through understanding. "Miss Matthews," a young voice called out. A current student, Emily Chen, Linda's granddaughter. "Is it true what they say about you being a warrior before? You were a teacher?" Sarah knelt down, meeting the child's eyes just as she had with countless students before. "The truth is, Emily, I was always a teacher. I just had to learn what that really meant." Later that afternoon, they gathered at the mountain overlook. The old mine entrance had long since vanished, reclaimed by nature and time. But its lessons remained, carried forward in the thousands of lives touched by what had started here. "Sometimes I wonder," Thompson's son mused, "what would have happened if you'd made a different choice that night? If you'd chosen revenge instead of transformation?" "The world has enough warriors," Sarah replied, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of possibility. "What it needs are teachers, people who can show others there's always another way." Her phone lit up with updates from around the globe, schools in former conflict zones implementing her methods, communities transforming through education, cycles of violence being broken one classroom at a time. The Matthews Educational Research Center, established a decade ago, had proven what Sarah had always known: children taught to understand their strength rather than fear. It became not just better students, but better humans. "You know what Jake would say about all this?" Thompson's son gestured at the peaceful valley below. "About his combat tactics being used to teach kindergartners emotional intelligence." Sarah smiled, remembering Jake's last recorded words: "The best weapon is the one between your ears." The evening found them in Sarah's old classroom, now a living museum of educational transformation. The walls held 2 decades of evolution, from simple conflict resolution techniques to comprehensive programs in emotional and social intelligence. Jake's badge still hung in its place of honor, but it was surrounded by something far more powerful: thousands of letters from students whose lives had been changed, whose paths had been redirected from violence to wisdom. The cartels used to tell stories about La Maestra, Amy mentioned, running her hand along the wall of memories. Now my students tell different stories, stories about the teacher who showed them that true strength isn't in their fists, but in their hearts. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. A message from the United Nations Educational Committee. They were adopting the Matthews Method as part of their global peace initiative. The ripples had become waves, touching shores far beyond that mountain. "Knight, you know what the real miracle is?" Linda Chen's voice came from the doorway, age having softened but not diminished her presence. "Not that you chose wisdom over violence, but you showed others they could make the same choice." As night fell over Pine Creek, Sarah stood at her classroom window one last time. Tomorrow she would retire, passing the torch to a new generation of educators trained in methods that had evolved far beyond their tactical origins. The mountain stood silent against the stars, its secrets long since transformed into lessons that had changed the world. In classrooms across the globe, children were learning what Sarah had discovered on that fateful night, that the most dangerous force wasn't violence, but the power to transform it into something better. Jake's old silver watch still kept perfect. Time, its inscription, now the motto of schools worldwide. Justice without mercy is tyranny. Mercy without justice is surrender. Wisdom is knowing how to balance both. The night deepened, and Sarah Matthews, teacher, transformer, bearer of a legacy more powerful than violence, prepared for her final lesson. Not about what had happened in the mountain's shadows, but about what had grown in the light of understanding. Some stories ended in gunfire and glory, but the most important ones ended in classrooms and wisdom and the quiet victory of peace over violence. That was the real legacy of the teacher who had been underestimated. Not because of what she could destroy, but because of what she chose to build. And in schools across the world, where children learn to be strong without being cruel, brave without being violent, powerful without being destructive, that legacy continued to grow, not in darkness and revenge, but in light and hope and the endless possibility of transformation. For in the end, the most dangerous force in the world wasn't the ability to take life. It was the wisdom to transform it. And that was a lesson worth teaching. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.